All right, I hope you all can hear me. Seems to be working. On the wonderful subject of ethics, first things first, this is not going to be a preaching session. It's pretty easy to get stuck in that particular hole when you start talking about ethics, because everyone is always ethical, of course. There's no such thing as bad ethics within a company, and every company ever is doing the right thing. I've been in this business for a decent while. I've done a lot of shit that is not illegal, but certainly not ethical. I think that goes for probably most of you in the room as well. So let's look at some cases where this might be problematic or interesting. The first one was from back when I was starting out. I was 22 years old and worked for a company called Lemon Planet back then, and they merged a couple of times, and now those guys are known as Nexus. So we had this customer demo, a big one, and it wasn't anywhere near ready. So we were sitting there the night before. We cobbled some interfaces together with string and bubblegum, and of course presented this to the customer as almost production-ready code. If you ever worked for an early-stage startup, you probably recognize something like this. Is this technically speaking lying to the customer? Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing really ethical about this. We're squarely lying to the customer. Guess how Microsoft made their money? Same thing. They lied to the customer, and they took a chance, and they managed to deliver, and then, hey, big company. And you sort of expect startups to lie to the customer in the first place. I mean, if you trust a vendor, then I got a bridge to sell you. A couple of years down the line, I worked for a sports betting and poker room. So for those of you who aren't from Sweden, in Sweden you get paid once a month. And this one particular month, you got paid on a Friday. On Monday, we got this guy calling in saying that, hey, you guys overcharged my account. So we looked into it and realized that, actually no, we didn't overcharge his account. But pretty much every 4 or 5 hours, like clockwork, from Friday when he got paid until Monday, he topped up his poker account and lost the money, and topped it up and lost the money, and topped it up and lost the money. And he couldn't really connect this thing that I played a lot of online poker, I lost the money, with, hey, why is my checking account empty? I mean, just to be clear, that was an absolute minority of the users that fit that description. Gambling addiction is a real problem, but it's for a very, very small subset of users. So it wasn't really our problem per se. I mean, we provided a platform, but so did dozens of other actors as well. And if you turn on the TV tonight, you'll see a lot of poker ads on Swedish television. But nonetheless, even though we weren't technically speaking to blame, we provided a platform for this guy and others like him to gamble away his life. Is that right? Is that wrong? Did we do anything wrong per se? We probably handle it better than most of the other guys in the business. But still, is it right? Is it something you want to be doing? And that's the thing that's so interesting about ethics, because it's never really black or white. It's always shades of gray, and who thinks what? It's in the eye of the beholder. So the last case I'll be talking about, which is a slightly longer one, is about my former employer, which is called Procera Networks. And just to be crystal clear here, none of these companies I list here are bad companies per se. I wouldn't even say that they are unethical companies. But I would say that ethics is problematic in a way where we need to talk about ethics. And hopefully you can learn something from my mistakes and our mistakes. Much like the IoT discussion that was mentioned earlier, we should talk about failure and be candid about that, otherwise we'll be getting nowhere. And yeah, it might be a career-limiting move, but I'm already fired from that place, so hey. So what does Procera do? They do a range of appliances that does traffic management, traffic inspection, and it's powered by deep packet inspection. That's one of the core selling points. So you can take a lot of traffic, you can group it by DSLAM, by channel, by site, by whatever you happen to have in your topology. And you can also group that by layer 7 protocol. Getting around the problem where no one's actually using QoS header flags for anything, because you really can't. So this is a way of dealing with that. So the product is pretty capable in that you can even drill down real time to a particular stream passing through the thing and get the metadata for that particular connection. So you can do a lot of really useful things when it comes to quality of service, to network intelligence, how much is video growing, when do we need to expand, all that sort of shit. So when I joined that company, that was in 2007, I joined as a traffic signature developer, meaning I had to make sure that the product actually recognized the traffic going through it, meaning I looked at more layer 7 protocols than probably most of you guys in this room. And wept quite a few times because most of them actually suck as well, but hey. At the end of the gig there, I was a product manager instead. But back then when we started out, when I joined the company at least, we were looking at products that had 1 gig interfaces. And looking at the network situation back then, I mean, we had a lot of protocols that were horribly bad when it came to security. For things like World of Warcraft, we could, in the plane, see what's the character name, what's the level, what's the race, what are they doing. For the messaging platforms, you could usually see the conversations going over the wire in plain text. Not always the credentials, but actually fairly often even the credentials, even the passwords. And even some of the services that are well known today for being good at privacy and security, for instance, WhatsApp, they actually spent their first 3 years sending messages in plain text over the network. So the situation back then was pretty crap. And that meant that we had a need pretty early on for at least some type of a policy when it comes to what do we extract in this product. I mean, you have the capabilities to extract quite a lot of data. Technically speaking, we could just say, okay, here's a password, let's expose this in the interface. But there's really no good use case for that. And the potential for abuse is just massive. So we drew a line in the sand saying, we will not be exporting passwords. We will not be exporting conversations. We are okay with exporting things like identifying endpoints, identifying users, phone numbers, screen names, that kind of stuff, but no passwords, no actual content per se. Fast forward to 2016, and that's a PL15K, which is top of the line for that particular product line. This thing is a 4-unit thing that's pretty damn massive when it comes to traffic. It will shoot through 600 gigabits per second of actual honest-to-God internet traffic, not just something you make up in the lab to make the product look pretty. And for those of you who worked with this kind of stuff before, you know that this is a weasel word because the thing that really will kill one of these stateful things is connections per second. Thing is, it'll deal with that very gracefully as well. While this may sound a lot like a sales pitch, imagine that in a rack of these things, you can churn through roughly 8 terabits of data per second. So if you wanted to cover the connections in and out of a country, you could technically do that, and the bill of materials for doing so wouldn't be all that expensive. This, of course, was enticing news to some of the places in the world that want to have slightly more control over their population for various reasons. One of these being the UAE. And they had a pretty simple case up front. I mean, the UAE has a 90% expat population. So only 10% of the people actually living in the country are from that country. The rest moved there and are guest workers to some extent. And when the guest workers, many of them fairly poor people from India and Pakistan, because the conditions in Dubai, for instance, isn't all that great if you're from India and Pakistan. You don't get the really fancy jobs. You want to call home to your families, and a cheap and reliable way of doing so would be voice over IP. Only that means that you have revenue leakage for the local telecoms providers. And the telecom providers and the regulator for telecoms in that country all have ties to the royal families. So you have financial interests going all over the place. Meaning, we had a case there for blocking all VoIP calling because revenue leakage. Later on, that expanded into a case for blocking all VPNs because you can do porn over VPNs, you can do VoIP over VPNs, and that porn is illegal and VoIP is, well, revenue leakage. So the way this usually works, I mean, this is a pretty benign case in that you could see what's happening. They're blocking the traffic. It's obvious that someone is blocking your traffic. In other cases, you can see cases for mass surveillance instead. We want to capture all metadata or actual payload data for a subset of the traffic on a massive scale, as in the entire country. But in both of those types of cases, the driver isn't the internet provider. I mean, we're talking to the internet provider. They're our customer. But they are driven by the regulator. The regulator says, you need to implement this. If you don't, then you don't have a license to operate. And the operator comes to us and says, hey, we need this functionality. And it's not really optional, because if you can't deliver this, we need to go to your competitor instead. And that's how it works. I mean, if you want to sell to a number of countries in the world, table stakes is that you do whatever the regulator fancies that you should be doing. Is this by itself unethical? Well, hard to say. Do I like these use cases? No, I think they stink, frankly. But would I presume to say that I think they stink? My idea here should trump whatever idea they have locally. I mean, do I know that country better than their local politicians, the local government, the local regulator? Probably not. If I were to impose my opinion here, wouldn't that be akin to digital imperialism? Yeah, probably would be. And it's also very easy to draw a line between what's legal and what's ethical, and saying that we're doing something that isn't illegal, meaning we're doing something ethical. It's a very simple distinction to make, and it's also totally bollocks, so don't do that. But when you have a deal worth a couple of $1 million on the table, and you have the option to say, no, this, we shouldn't be doing this because it sort of smells, versus we should be doing this because there's a couple of $1 million on the table, you better have some very convincing arguments to say, let's leave that money on the table. And if you're a public company, good luck with that. So another deal that came in last year, in March, was from Turkey, where one of the operators said, hey, we need this particular piece of equipment here. We have been talking about an upgrade before. We need this functionality because the regulator, ICTA, they require us to have it. That functionality was to extract usernames, passwords, other metadata, especially from email, endpoints, site address, from pretty much all unencrypted data you saw over the internet. And since people tend to reuse their passwords across multiple sites, even in Turkey, I'm assuming, that means that you have a pretty good chance of getting passwords for a pretty large, substantial number of people in the population. So is this a bad case by itself? Sort of yes, sort of no. I mean, you see this kind of stuff happening, driven by the US pretty much all the time, all the Snowden revelations and all that. We would still sell stuff to the US without thinking twice. But given the situation in Turkey back then, I'll give you some examples. Man who depicted Erdogan as a golem given a suspended sentence. This guy was posting a picture on his Facebook wall where he compared golems' faces versus the president's faces. And they actually prosecuted him for that. Another one, teen arrested for insulting the president. And this might sound kind of silly, but there's an Article 299 in the Turkish Penal Code, meaning that you can actually get a multi-year sentence for doing this. On top of this, on a more serious note than people doing silly stuff on Facebook, we had a case where there had been alleged support for ISIS from the Turkish government. You had a number of corruption scandals. You had academics being fired. You had the judiciary being fired because they were pretty much backing the wrong political horse. So all in all, you have a government that's sort of sliding towards authoritarianism, and you have a very prickly leader. Should we be dealing with that? Frankly, no. From my point of view, there's a really definite chance that someone could get seriously hurt or actually killed as a result of whatever data they would be collecting using our devices. Since this request landed on my desk, I was the product manager. I said, no, hard no, this, no, just not what we're going to be doing. We're not that kind of company. It doesn't fit with the product. There's a huge risk to the brand. There's just so many arguments against and no really good arguments for, besides for, hey, here's the deal. And so the way these things usually work, that was my opinion. You could make another case for this, and that is that you have this country. They're also a NATO country, and they have a huge problem with domestic terrorism, which they do. So they need the tools to weed out the terrorists. Besides, who are we to to try to overrule what they think is ethical? I mean, they know their own government and people and all that. So I was overruled, and frankly, there is a good case to make about all that. They do have a huge problem with domestic terrorism in Turkey, and the political situation is not in any way straightforward. It hasn't been for a long while. So it's not by any stretch a black and white scenario. I was backing the whiter part of it, saying that we shouldn't do it, but I wouldn't say that saying, yes, we should do this deal is totally ethically corrupt either. But for me, that was passing the line in the sand. I mean, back in 2007, I'd said, let's not take passwords from the data and extract that. And this was exactly what we were doing in this case. So it was a pretty straightforward deal for me. I said, I need to go. I'm quitting. I actually didn't even ask my fiancée at the time about it. I told her afterwards saying, hey, I'm going to resign. Any other reason, then we would be having a discussion about this beforehand. But for this particular one, sorry, need to go. This was on a Friday. So I spent that Friday and weekend telling people up front. I mean, I had been working at the place for closer to 10 years. So I wanted to give some guys a heads up that I'm leaving. Most of the guys were understanding and supportive about it. But one of the narratives that kept coming was, I agree with your stance. I also think it sucks. I don't really like this from an ethical standpoint at all. But I have a pretty large mortgage. I have kids. I said that I don't like it already, but there's really nothing else I can do. I'm stuck here with this. I need to live with it. That wasn't just one or two of the guys. I was also, actually, especially in the managerial parts of the company. I mean, of course, you get a good salary, you get a nice house, you have a big mortgage, that's how it works. But me, I didn't have any kids, I had a tiny mortgage, I had some money on the bank, I could just say, okay, sorry, you need to go. You can't buy a new conscience, you really can't. So come Monday, I did what you usually do in that company. I sent an email to the all alias, everyone in the company saying that, hey, I'm leaving. I will be around for 90 days, so if there's any unfinished business you need me to deal with, I'll be here. But this Turkey deal here, pointing at the deal, it's past my line in the sand. Ethics is tricky. I don't blame anyone else for this. I'm not trying to guilt you into doing anything. But frankly, it just doesn't cut it for me. I'm out. So Tuesday morning, I wake up to VPN and email being cut off. And sort of seeing the writing on the wall, I Skype my boss saying, hey, this morning, should we be meeting at the office or should we be meeting at a coffee shop? And I think you can guess from the picture there where that went. You actually spend a surprising amount of time in coffee shops after something like this. When you're a persona non grata at the office, there's meetings with your managers, there's meeting with HR, there's meeting with random coworkers. I mean, if you're ever in this situation, get a rewards card. It's so worth it. But on a more serious note, I mean, no one is happy with a situation like that. I mean, I was set on closing things properly on my end, just wrapping my business and looking for the next job. My boss wasn't happy, understandably. HR wasn't happy. Management certainly wasn't happy. And my coworkers were decidedly very, very unhappy. Thing is, Swedish engineers don't particularly like mass surveillance as a concept. Who would have thunk? So there were some issues. Tempers were high. Angry emails were being sent to the corporate parent of Procera, saying that, hey, these guys are running the company in the ground. This is just super bad. Not a whole lot of work was getting done, and management had to do some, let's say, rescheduling of whatever was going to be happening over the next week, and then rather fly to Sweden and have a meeting and try to do something about the situation, which they did. But over the next few months, I was the only one who really, well, quit right there on the spot. It was my area, I was a product manager, what else could I do? But some of the other guys, they stayed on until they found new jobs. So over the next few months, you had people dropping off, some really competent people. And for the company, of course, that sucked, but that was sort of what happens when you do a mistake when it comes to ethical stuff. Because it's not always ethics itself that's the defining point of whether you stay or leave. But it can be a strike. If you're unhappy about something and then there's this whole ethical situation, that might be pushing you past the limit of, oh yeah, I should look for a new job because this sucks. I had one guy calling me up saying that, hey, my kids, they're in 4th grade. And some of their classmates, they're actually from the Middle East, from roughly these areas. And right now they're learning in school about the situation down there. When my kids come home and ask me, so what do you do? What do you do at work? What the hell am I going to tell them? And he also upped and left a couple of months after the whole thing went down. So fast forward yet another few months, you had an article. Actually, originally it was word on the grapevine that we had this journalist trying to get hold of people currently working at Procera or previously working at Procera, asking him a question because someone had leaked documents surrounding this deal and others to him. This guy did a pretty good dig. He made a well-researched article, to the most part. When you have people writing about technical stuff, there's always some details that go off, but for the biggest part, this is really quite accurate. And that meant that there was another case of management having to deal with the fallout from this decision yet one more time. And this, of course, led to other articles in the trade press and, unsurprisingly, some press coverage in Turkey as well. But that was sort of the end of the line for the whole Turkey deal. But there are some interesting takeaways to bring away from this all. And I had a decent amount of time to think about this. So here's what I learned in the end. Ethics is never universal. If you work for a multinational corporation, if you talk to 10 random colleagues, chances are that you'll be getting 6 different answers to the same ethics conundrum. Probably at least 6. So if you think, I think about ethics in this way, of course everyone else would be doing it as well because, hey, this is the only sane way of looking at it, you are wrong. You're sorely mistaken. And it's never going to be super clear cut. It's always going to be a shade of gray. Never black, never white. The other takeaway was that you have a visible upfront cost, but the big cost for failing in some ethics consideration is going to be hidden. In this case, you had the upfront consideration of the Turkey deal that do we leave the money on the table or do we not? But the hidden cost was that developers got very unhappy because they didn't want to make a product that was used for mass surveillance. So there was the fallout of dealing with that. You had quality talent leaving the company down the line. You had dealing with the press later on when all this leaked by whoever did that. So that cost is always going to be there. Which is not to say that I think they necessarily did the wrong thing in the particular consideration should we do this deal or not. Because if they would have gone the other way around, they would instead have pissed off sales. Guys who had been working on this deal for, say, 9 months, a year, and then this last minute, hey, here's a tiny little feature request that makes us able to grab this deal right here, right now. And the quarter wasn't all that good, so I mean, hey, it's a compelling argument for actually doing the deal. And if you don't at that point, then you will be pissing off sales. You will have quality people leaving from that side of the organization instead. So all things considered, it's the Kobayashi Maru of business. There's no win in that scenario. Third one, make sure that you can afford a conscience. Again, we're back at the whole thing with I have a mortgage, I have kids. If something were to happen at your place of employ today, where it pushed you past the boundary where you just had to get out. I can't really do this. I need to get out today. Would you be able to do that? Would you financially be okay saying, mic drop, I'm out? And if the answer is no, consider whether it would be a good idea to change that situation by whatever means it needs changing. Because you sleep a whole lot better tonight. I'll give you some examples in my case. After I left Procera, things that happened since in Turkey. 4,463 judges and prosecutors were dismissed. 302 journalists arrested. 187 media outlets shut down. And 60,002 people arrested. Do I sleep better at night for having put some distance between myself and all that going down, being a small part of that? Yes, yes, I do. And the final one is be explicit, which sort of sums the other ones up. Ethics isn't universal. If you want to do something about ethics, you have to be explicit about it. For a lot of other things in business, that's what you do. You say, we do this. This is our product, this is our commitments. And some of the saner companies also are very explicit about this is what we don't do, so that's clear. But ethics isn't always covered by that for some reason. And I actually didn't consider it in that way until the CEO of Procera, after this whole thing went down, gave me his take, and that was that it's really a business problem rather than an ethics problem. And he's right. You can see it as a business problem. If you rein in sales early on and say, hey, we won't do these types of deals, then you won't have the case where you have salespeople who invested a lot of time and they will be unhappy if you back out of it. And there's always also best practice from some other type of work to look at. Whatever problem you have, someone else had that problem before and they had to deal with it in a structured manner. And final slide. Seems I'm out of time, actually. Sorry about that. For this particular company, Net Intact, founded in 2000 by a couple of 20-somethings. Procera, 2007, that was what it looked like when I joined, 50 people. Procera, when I left, 350-ish people. At that point in 2007, I did what I could in terms of ethics. I set some guidelines. Everyone was okay with this. That's the line. But that was never re-established. That discussion was never re-had between that time and the 2016 case. And of course, the company will be changing under your feet. You won't notice it. But if you make the assumption that we had this discussion back when, unless someone says anything contradictory, it's still a go. This is still what's valid. That is not the case. It will change under your feet. If you care about ethics, talk about it. Have the discussion. See it as a business case. See it as a way of mitigating risk. And then you can do something about it. And I'm not sure if we have time for questions. You guys with the...
So we can maybe squeeze in a couple of quick questions or comments if you have anything for Kriss right now. Or, yes, microphone at the back, please.
Hi, Johan Lange, the Luck Concept. I'm curious about what were the value statements of the company at that time?
Sorry, come
What
again?
were the value statements by that company at that time?
We probably had some, but if it's like any other company I worked at, they are hidden in some management PowerPoint somewhere, not really a part of the day-to-day operations.
Okay, thanks.
Patrik Feldström, NetNode. Thank you very much for having this presentation. I was one of the persons at Cisco that was working with exactly this kind of thing regarding corporate social responsibility for Cisco and making these hard decisions of what equipment to sell in what geographical area. It is a very tough decision by the company to make, of course, just because you have all the money piled up on one of the tables, as you say. But because of this was one of the reasons, exactly the story you tell, why it's so important for a company not to only have the mission statement as a lip service, like you say, but actually implement that in the organization itself as a whole. And also for the company to actually not only have that sort of mission statement, but also translate that into day-to-day operations so that it does not end up a surprise to sales and others, which counted on, for example, finishing that deal. Because if it is the case you end up making those kind of late second decisions like you were talking about, might have happened or did happen or not happen, in that case, that's an indication that you have not done your homework. So this is one of my strongest recommendations why companies should work out their CSR policy, which has not only have to do with human rights issues, but also other kind of things like labor laws and blood diamonds and supply chain management. And so I can just recommend every one of you in the room to sort of look at the ethics in your company and try to encourage the company to work out these kind of things. So once again, thanks very much for both what you did, but also for explaining this to us. Thank you.
Cheers.
I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, but if there are any other questions or comments for Kriss, are you going to be around in the lunch break?
I'm going to be around. Poke me at lunch.
Okay. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. Thank you, Kriss.
Cheers.